everybody. My name is Carolyn McCollum, and I'm the co-chair of the ZSR Library Lecture Series Committee, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's event. Before I introduce our guest speaker, he would like for me to mention a few events that are going to be going on campus this month. Tonight at 7 o'clock in Tribble Hall, room C216, will be the first of a 3-part breast cancer narrative documentary film series. So if you're able to make that, please do. And then on February 14th, Valentine's Day, in this room, starting at 4 o'clock, Mark Spindelman, a professor of law at Ohio State University, will be speaking on LGBT politics under the Marriage Amendment. So, on to our guest speaker. Our guest speaker is Dr. Andrew Smiler. He is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Psychology. He has master's degrees in both clinical and developmental psychology, and in 2003 he received his doctorate in developmental psychology from the University of New Hampshire. His areas of research include masculinity and normative sexual development during adolescence and young adulthood. In November 2012, his book, Challenging Casanova Beyond the Stereotype of the Promiscuous Young Male, was published by Jossie Bass. In today's lecture, Dr. Smiler explores how we as a society have come to believe that young men are primarily interested in short-term hookup sex and uninterested in relationships. He will discuss some of his research on young men's dating and sexual experiences, much of which challenges the stereotypical portrayal of young men as Casanovas. Without further ado, Dr. Andrew Smiler.
Thank you all, and I'd like to thank Carolyn for the invitation. It's quite an honor to be here. ZSR doesn't invite that many people to speak, so it's really nice to be over here and out of my own building. And I want to thank you all for coming today. I'll encourage you all to buy the book. Available everywhere, including here on campus and bookstore. That is a picture of Giacomo Casanova. He was a real guy. He did exist. Before I start, so, you know, it's nice being the guy with the PhD. You get to write a book and your name goes on the front. There are lots of folks who contributed to the work that I'm going to talk about today. And not everybody who contributed to the book is listed. These are just the folks who contributed to some of the studies that I'm going to talk about. So you may know some of the folks in the last paragraph down there, a group of Wake Forest undergrads who have helped me out. But all these folks should get at least a little bit of their due, and their time is up. Sorry. Before we get started, and certainly there are a few folks who've had me in class, you all know that I'm interactive in class, I'd like you to take a moment just to imagine an 18-year-old heterosexual boy. It's the summer after he's graduated from high school, he's getting ready to go away to college. He drops by his best friend's house, and this is his longtime best friend. He knows not only his friend, but the parents really well. He sometimes calls them mom and dad, and they're fine with that. They've told him, you know, you don't need to knock. You can just come in. You can open the door. That's fine. He mostly knocks. He stops by his friend's house one day, discovers his friend is not home, but the door is answered by his friend's 16-year-old sister, who says, you know, I was just going to go out in the back and sunbathe. Sister's wearing a pair of Daisy Dukes and a bikini top. Our 18-year-old boy says, She's like, I was going to go sunbathe, but why don't you come in and, like, we'll just hang out. What do y'all think happens next? All right. Just by show of hands here, who thinks our intrepid 18-year-old heterosexual boy just turns around, says no thanks, turns around, and goes on his way? Anyone? Bueller? We got two over here. Okay. They hang out. Nothing sexual happens. They just, like, play Nintendo or whatever. About that, more than half the room. I don't usually get that many. They hang out and something sexual happens. Couple of folks, okay, the minority there. We have this cultural conception, which I'm calling the Casanova Complex, that teenage boys, young men, guys in their 20s, just want sex. That's all they're interested in. They don't care where or when or with whom. They're not interested in any kind of emotional connection. They don't want commitment. And we as a nation really believe that this describes most, if not all, teenage boys and young men. This notion that we as a culture hold contributes to sex ed curricula. If you look at analyses of published curricula on sex education, this is the guy that shows up, that is most likely to show up. And there are many curricula where this is the only depiction of male sexuality. It also shows up in parenting and the talk. We know that only about half of adolescents have the talk with their parents. For boys who have the talk, the vast majority of them have a talk that lasts less than 10 minutes, usually consists of the three don'ts. Don't have sex, don't get anyone pregnant, don't get a disease. It's a pretty short conversation. It contributes in some ways to boys, and by extension girls, sexual risk-taking, having sex with a partner that you don't know very well, having sex without a condom, having sex while under the influence of substances, especially with someone you don't know very well. Contributes to national unplanned pregnancy rate among teens and national rates of STIs. And I got to tell you, when it comes to Western nations, we're number one. Go team. We got more teenagers with unwanted pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections than anybody else. Oh, that's not good. And in some ways, this really seems to be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. For those of you who are not quite familiar there, this is a baby bib and a onesie that I have found in national retailers here in the Winston-Salem area. You can never start teaching kids too early about sex. Yeah. So, all right. So the talk is going to go in 2 parts. The book goes in 3 parts. You have to buy the book if you want part 3. We're going to talk a little bit about why this perception of young men exists. And I'm mostly going to focus on differences between males and females. And then the second part of the talk, and actually a little bit longer part of the talk, is we're going to look at some of the data about what actually happens. People have been studying adolescent sexual behavior for a long time. I would like to think that I've added my little pieces in there. But we know a fair amount about what's going on. At least we as researchers do. And a lot of it doesn't really get out to the public. So I'm going to start off with perception, why we think that young men just want sex. And a lot of this focuses, again, on sex differences between men and women. There is a long database that demonstrates that young men and young women are different, or at least tell us different things on surveys. We know that young men report more actual partners and say that they want more partners than do women. Young men report a greater willingness to have sex with someone they've recently met. Young men and teenage boys, on average, report a younger age of first sex, greater enjoyment of that first sexual experience, fewer negatives related to that first sexual experience. Young men tell us that they are much less likely than young women to refuse an offer of sexual activity. And to some extent, where we've looked at kind of more masculine versus less masculine guys, we see that the effects are stronger for the guys that are more macho. One of the explanations for this that has made its way out of the research land and into the public sphere is sexual strategies theory. This is actually an outgrowth of sociobiology, for those of you who were around in the 80s or know your history. This sexual strategies theory identifies itself as based in evolutionary psychology, relies a lot on the fact that women can really only have about 1 child per year, whereas a man could theoretically sire hundreds. Also, that women are always certain it's their child because it comes out of their body. Although having been there at that moment, I'm not sure that, my wife would have identified that particular child 10 minutes later. They look a lot different in that moment. But, us guys, never quite 100% sure. I mean, how would we really know? Based on these kinds of straightforward biological facts and some of the other data that you've already seen, these folks argue that women should seek and choose one partner carefully, in particular a partner who is going to support them while they're pregnant and immediately after delivery when they are less able, and men should basically screw around. This table, which is stunningly clear on the display there, this table comes from one of the largest studies of its kind coming out of the sexual strategies theory literature, published by David Schmidt and a team of over 100 collaborators from around the world. David Schmidt is one of the key authors of sexual strategies theory. They put together this research team and collected data from 100 young men, 100 young women in each of 62 different nations or islands or semi-autonomous regions around the globe. You can see down the left-hand side the region of the world we're talking about. That first numeric column is the percentage of men who say that they want 2 or more partners in the next 30 days. And the focal question in a lot of this research is how many partners do you want in the next 30 days? The next numeric column is the percentage of women who want 2 or more partners in the next 30 days. And then for you, those of you who care, the statistical significance test all the way on the right. What you'll notice clearly is that guys, regardless of the region, are in double digits and women are in single digits, regardless of the region. For guys, it runs from about 18 to 35%. For women, it runs from about 2.5% to 7%. Huge differences. For the sample as a whole, 25% of guys from each of these 62 nations, islands, or semi-autonomous regions said they want 2 or more partners in the next 30 days, compared to about 6% of women. But let's run that the other way. 18 to 35% of guys across regions said that they wanted 2 or more partners in the next 30 days. That means that somewhere between 65 and 82% of guys in each of these regions did not want 2 or more partners in the next 30 days. They want 0 or 1 partner in the next 30 days. Where I learned math, that's a majority. And I think the majority is important to notice, even though we get this rather substantial difference between what men and women are saying. Somehow that bit gets left out in a lot of the public discussions. And then we have a rather sexualized culture. We see this guy, this Casanova character, over and over in the mass media. And often apparently drinking, which I will tell you it was not something I was particularly conscious of when I was pulling photos, but it's there. Those of you who are familiar with MASH may remember that Hawkeye had a still in his tent. There are 6 TV shows represented up here, with the exception of Martin. They all won an Emmy for Best Show. With the exception of Martin Lawrence, all 5 of those actors have won Emmys for Best Actor in a comedy, with the exception of poor Neil Patrick Harris, who is a supporting character, not the lead. Martin Lawrence and the TV show Martin also won several BET Awards, or Black Heritage Awards. All of these shows ran for at least 7 years, with the exception of Martin, which drew more of a black audience than a white audience. They were top 20 shows for almost their entire run. And this character was the central character. And then we have things like Maxim. And if you read Maxim and pay attention and try and figure out who the audience is, it's pretty much this same guy. It's an older teen or a young adult, somebody in their 20s, not really in a committed relationship. And we see that over and over, and we get the emphasis on having lots and lots of sexual partners. There are also plenty of seats on this side. You can come onto this side around the hallway. Going to have great intermission sales today. Anybody still do intermission sales? All right. So this guy, this image is rather pervasive. Along with a team of about a dozen Wake Forest students, we wanted to extend the analysis from visual media and print media into music. So those crazy kids helped me go through song lyrics from the last 50 years. We looked at the top 50 songs from even-numbered years because we wanted to make it easy on ourselves. From 1960 to 2008, That's 25 years worth of songs, 50 songs per year, 1,250 songs. We went through every song twice because we didn't actually want to make it that easy on ourselves. We score, among other things, we just looked at whether or not the song talks about some kind of dating relationship or ongoing romantic relationship, and whether or not the song makes any reference to sex. 250 songs per decade. This is the overall. In each one of the last 5 decades, somewhere around 150 songs out of the top 250 that are about dating. The blue line at the top. The red line, and they're just talking about dating. The red line at the bottom, songs that mention sex without also talking about dating or some kind of romantic relationship. And you can see there are very few of those. The line is near zero through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then it starts to increase over the last 2 decades. The green line in the middle there, songs that address both dating and sex. We get lots of making love there in the 70s. That's that first jump, and then it really kind of levels out after that. Nobody talks about making love anymore. It's all just sex. If we just look at female performers, this is the figure we get. And the category of female performers includes female solo artists, folks like, say, Madonna and Beyonce. Super Bowl week, right? Got to talk about Beyonce. But it also includes all female groups like Diana Ross and the Supremes and the Pussycat Dolls. And we see the same. Don't often hear them in the same sentence, do you? One wonders what Diana thinks about the Pussycat Dolls. Anyway, we get this same pattern, right? Mostly songs about dating or romance, very few songs that just talk about sex. The red line at the bottom is near zero throughout the 5 decades. And some songs in the middle, but still a small minority. I want to point out one other thing. I know the numbers aren't necessarily clear from where you're sitting. Songs about dating by women, somewhere between 40 to 60 songs per decade. Tops out, I think, 64 there in the 90s. This is the figure for male performers. Starts with Elvis, doesn't quite come forward to the Biebs. He wasn't there in 2008. But we got a lot of Jack Johnson, John Mayer, the Beatles are in there, the Stones, the Backstreet Boys. The Stones are not a boy band. The Backstreet Boys are a boy band. I'm not quite sure what the difference is. But the number of songs, I know what the difference is, Ron. The number of songs that are just about dating or just about a romantic relationship, no sex, the blue line at the top, again, still at the top all the way across. But a pretty clear decrease across the last 5 decades. The red line at the bottom, songs about sex, again, almost none of those for the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then a pretty clear increase over the last 2 decades. And the green line, the songs about making love, in the middle there. I pointed out that no more than about 64 songs about dating by women in the top 50 here for any decade. For men, it bottoms out at 60 over each of the last 2 decades. No matter what decade we're talking about, there are more songs by guys, by male performers, about dating than there are songs from female performers about dating in the year-end top 50. Those are the numbers. About 5 songs by male performer for every 2 songs in female performers in the year-end charts. When we do this stuff as percentages, and I'm not going to show you the figure for percentages, what we find is that women have a higher percentage of songs that talk about dating, and it's statistically significant for those of you that are into that. But I just want to point out the raw numbers here. If you're just listening to pop radio, you're more likely to hear a song about dating from a guy or from some male voice than from a woman. What this contributes to, though, is this sex difference and that drop in songs by male performers about dating and the increase in songs about sex by male performers is a perception of difference that's based on comparative differences, what we get when we compare males to females. Certainly the group differences exist, but the group differences are coming from a minority of data. 25% of guys in a worldwide study say they want 2 or more partners, compared to 6% of women. Huge difference, but a minority of guys. Most songs by male performers talking about dating, the minority talking about sex, but the minority rules because we get these differences when we compare men and women. This, I think, is part of what reinforces the stereotype that we get taught. But then there's this whole other reality that I'm going to tell you about. And this is actual experience. And we're going to go through a number of different aspects of this here. And a lot of this is my research, but again, not all of it, because I get to talk and I want to talk about me. It's all about me. We'll start with Casanova, the guy whose name I'm using without his permission, but he's been dead for a long time. In his memoirs, which the historians validate as reasonably accurate, he reports sleeping with about 3 women per year over a 40-year span. And he's actually kind of remarkably consistent in 3 women per year. It's not like it's all happening in his 20s and then he fades out. He's pretty consistent there. If you look at samples from the US, samples from other English-speaking countries, and occasionally places where they don't speak English, but they're nice enough to publish in English, what you get is that in any given year, somewhere between 15 to 20% of guys report that they have had 3 or more sexual partners in the last 12 months. When you get studies that expand that to 3 years running, guys who had 3 or more partners for 3 consecutive years, now we're down to about 5%. This does not fit our stereotype. This does not fit the image of, how we as Americans think of what boys and young men are supposed to be doing. But this is the reality that we see on survey after survey. I got the chance to work with Deb Tolman, who some of you know for her research on girls' desire. She's also collected data on boys occasionally. And she lent me some data of hers that comes from 105 10th grade boys. 92 of them, about 90%, had experience with dating. 43 of them, about 40%, had experience with sex. And that's 40% is about typical for 10th grade boys. That we see that a lot on surveys. That is not an unusual number. They were given a list of reasons why they got into their most recent dating relationship, separate set of reasons for why they got into their most recent, why they had their most recent sexual experience. And they were told to check off as many of these as fit. These are the reasons that they endorsed for dating. By far, 80% of the sample, number 1, with a bullet, 80% said, I liked the person. Nice reaffirming reason there for going on a date with someone. The next 2, endorsed by a little bit more than half the sample, 55% of the folks, I wanted to get to know the person, which suggests that this is kind of early in the dating relationship, and also that I was really attracted to this person. There was something about them. These are the top 3 reasons boys endorsed for dating, and they all suggest that it's really about the person they're dating. It's not about trying to get laid or anything like that. I will point out 2 of these at the bottom, the least frequent reasons. 6%, about a little bit more than 1 guy in 5, saying I didn't want to be the only one without a girlfriend or boyfriend, although none of the boys said that they wanted a boyfriend. And about 20%, about 1 in 5, saying that they were dating because they felt like they should be in a relationship. So there's a little bit of peer pressure going on here. If we then look at their motives for sex, a 3-way tie for number 1, my favorite, listed first. I liked or loved the person. Sex is about connection to someone else, he said the week before Valentine's Day. Accidental, but I'm going with it. We hear this a lot in popular culture, right? You're not supposed, it's okay to have sex with a person if you love them. Certainly that's a message that teenagers get. It's a message that young adults hear. And not quite 2/3 of our boys on this study saying that was part of what was going on for them. Same percentage, 63%, saying I felt desire, so they were turned on in some way. They were excited about this. Again, not quite 2/3, 63%, saying they wanted to find out what it's like. These are 10th graders. A lot of them are telling us about their first sexual experience. It is a milestone in that way. And these are the top 3 reasons. The next one down, 51%, my partner wanted to. Always a good sign. And we have bad words for when your partner really, really doesn't want to. But maybe partner actually initiating there, providing some clear signal saying, well, hey, let's do this. All the way at the bottom, 9% saying, only 9% saying that they were doing this, they're having sex to fit in with their friends. So some kind of peer pressure, as we saw for dating. Again, here for sex, those 9% of boys who said that their sexual experience was about fitting in with friends also endorsed at least one other reason on this list. So nobody's having sex just to fit in. So these are motives. A lot of motives about connection, about who their partner is, something about relationship. A separate study with my postdoctoral mentor, Monique Ward, at the University of Michigan, we looked at reactions to first sex. Data came from 118 male and 217 female undergraduates. They were given a list of descriptors, said on a 1 to 7 scale, how much did this apply or not apply to your first sexual experience. We used something called factor analysis for the stats geeks out there to break this into 4 different groups. A positive factor that consisted of items like I felt happy, I felt excited, I felt satisfied. A negative cluster that included things like I felt used or sad or embarrassed. Something we called empowered, I felt adult-like or in control or powerful. And then a loving factor, I felt loved or loving someone else. Again, what we've heard and what we've seen repeatedly in the research is that women report more negatives and fewer positives than men when describing their first sexual intercourse. We get the same thing here. Score on negatives, women have a higher score. On positives, women have a lower score. But I want to point out something else, because I'm like that. We asked, it's a 1 to 7 scale, which means 4 is the middle. The score for negatives for both men and women is below the middle of the scale. The score for positives is above 4. It's on the higher side. And of course, higher scores for positive than negative for both men and women. It is not that women have bad first sexual experiences and men have good ones. It's a relative difference. A little bit worse for women, a little bit less positive for women at the same time. But we're getting things that other folks have found repeatedly. And then we have these other 2 things that folks haven't looked at. We talk about feelings of empowerment. Men have a slightly higher score, but not very much, and not statistically significant for those of you who are into that kind of thing. And men also describing this as a reasonably loving experience. Again, that score is higher than 4. It's above the middle of the scale. We don't typically ask teenage boys that kind of question. Oddly, we don't really ask it for girls either. We just kind of assume it's there. And you'll notice that boys' loving score isn't quite as high as girls, but it's still getting there. Following a different survey, and again with Monique Ward at my postdoc, we given another survey that got details regarding dating and sexual behavior from 182 male, 397 female undergraduates. And we recruited 20 men to be interviewed. The recruitment for this started with the survey. At the end of the survey, they were asked, would you be willing to come in and be interviewed about this? And if you are, give us your email address. And then we recruited 20 guys with various levels of sexual experience. The interview started off with what seemed like two pretty basic questions. How do you define dating, and how do you define hooking up? Across the board, the guys were pretty clear that dating refers to some kind of longer-term relationship. There is an expectation of monogamy. Certainly was expected to include kissing, might or might not include some kind of sexual activity. And the guys were pretty clear about hooking up, at least as they started to answer the question. The hookup is not committed. There's no relationship. It's expected to be short-term, typically just one night. And they all started off by saying, and I usually think sex. And then I, as the interview would say, usually, and they would be like, well, I know a lot of people who will just make out with a girl, and then they'll say they hooked up. So there's not actually sex going on there. But your first thought is, it's always sex. We heard that from a lot of the guys. And in a minute, you're going to hear some of their stories about their actual experiences. But one of the things we noticed as we were hearing the stories about their actual experiences is a lot of guys would also then talk about hooking up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. someone that they were already in a committed relationship with. So they're using hookup at some points to talk about their dating relationship. None of the guys ever accidentally described someone that they were hooking up with as a dating relationship. It wasn't like, oh yeah, there was this person that I dated for one night last week, and wow. Like, we didn't hear that story, that kind of terminological shift. Same guys, later in the interview, asked to tell the story of their most recent hookup, their most recent experience of sex, some kind of sexual activity, within a relationship context. And we broke these guys down into 4 groups. First off, there is the group of Casanovas, the guys who really are fitting the stereotype. They reported multiple coital partners, both in hookup settings and in relationship settings. Then we get the guys that I'm calling romantics, relatively few partners, and almost all of their experience comes within dating relationships. A third set of guys, religious guys, they're doing something quite different. Very little dating from these guys and no sex. And then a group that I'm putting there in the middle called emo or emotional. These guys have a fair number of partners, both in hookups and in relationships. And you'll hear from them. They're also a little bit different than what we might expect. We'll start off with the Casanovas. All of the names you'll hear and see are pseudonyms. The guys chose these, both for themselves and for the folks they're talking about. To keep this a little bit more straightforward during presentation, I'm just presenting interviews from guys with female partners. We heard pretty much the same stories across the board from guys with male partners. So know that's there as well, and I can talk more about that when we take questions. Andrew, pseudonym. I didn't ask him about it in the moment. I should probably just change it to make my life easier, but we'll go with it. On the survey, Andrew told us that he had fooled around in one way or another with 5 girls he dated, another 5 women in hookup settings. He'd had sex with 3 women he dated, and he'd hooked up with about 20. Told me a story about Rachel. He met Rachel during winter break one year. He and a couple of his buddies had rented a cabin at a ski resort. Some of them were there with partners. Some of them were there on their own. They decided to have a party one night. They invited some girls that they had met there at the lodge. Alcohol flowed freely. Andrew and Rachel hooked up. And he says, it was like a one-night thing. I'm not really interested in her, really. It was kind of like we were there kind of thing. No commitment. He never knew Rachel's last name, never asked for a number, email. This was very explicitly straightforward, just about hooking up. And he was explaining to me a little bit later on in the interview how he differentiates between hooking up and dating relationships. And he says, I'll either really need to like the girl and go out for a while, and usually I want to be sober if I have sex. Go, dude. Always nice. But the other way is I just have to hook up with a person. I'll know them for a little bit or just not generally care about them at all. Let's go back to our definitions that came from this whole group of guys. A hookup is with someone is expected to be short-term, no connection, just about the sex. He's right on target here. This is really our common definition of what a hookup is, kind of our expectation of how a hookup should go. And he's right on target with his acts and his descriptions. And then we get romantic guys like Derek. Derek had made out with 3 girls within the context of dating relationships, had never done that as a hookup. He'd had sex with 2 girls he was dating, and he'd had sex with one woman as a hookup. That woman's name was Emily. They hooked up during his sophomore year. But Emily's an ex. Derek and Emily dated during high school. They broke up during senior year before graduation. But, same town, same group of friends. They were still in touch, would still see each other during break. Emily decides to come visit Derek, with his permission, during sophomore year at a time when she knows he's not seeing anyone. We will put Emily's motives aside. This is a story about Derek. They hooked up. Derek says, it seemed like, and this is his only hookup experience in his life. Derek says, it seemed like hooking up had more meaning to it because it was emotional, although we both knew that at the same time it was just once and nothing to take too seriously. For Andrew, our Casanova, you only hook up with people that you are not emotionally connected to. For Derek, his one and only hookup happens because it's someone that he's emotionally connected to. This is not our stereotype. He's doing something different here. And then Derek talking about Sarah, who he dated for several months. Derek and Sarah, to the great delight of sex educators everywhere, went and got tested for HIV before they had sex the first time. Go, guys. Derek explained, the reason I waited, not just used a condom, is because I developed a great affection for her that I knew to stick around. I knew I wanted to be there for a long time. Again, for Derek, that emotional piece coming in. I'm not going to rush sex. We're going to go and get tested, and I'm okay with waiting because I really care about this person. Kind of what we expect on the romantic side, to the extent that we expect a romantic side. Then we get religious guys like John B. As you can see, almost no experience there for John B. He'd had some kind of making out with one woman that he'd dated, and that's the entirety of his dating and sexual experience. Asked about why he hasn't hooked up now, says, I see my perspective on this is changing to be even more like in line with what God wants. I mean, like, before, I might have joked around with my friends. Of course, I'm not out having sex. Now, I can't even see myself really having that conversation without saying, like, hey, this is what's right. And according to John B., what's right is abstinence prior to sex. Asked about the possibility that he might that he might have sex with his partner before they got married, but say while they're engaged. Says, I'm trying to save myself for marriage and be, I guess you could say, kind of pure for my wife, my future wife, whoever that might be. John B., as you might guess, is Christian. And that's very clearly informing his practice here. His dating and sexual activity very much guided by what we hear of as the Christian approach to dating and sex. Sex is about procreation. It happens with your marital partner, period, end of story. And this is very much shaping John B.'s experience. John B. and the guys like him that I've interviewed also told me that you don't date just to date. You date to find a lifetime partner. If you're dating someone for 2 or 3 months and you're not thinking about marriage with that person or talking about marriage with that person, then you're kind of wasting your time and you should end it. Because the whole point of dating is to find a marital partner, as opposed to most of the rest of the guys who are dating because, hey, we can date. And then we get the emo guys like Mr. G. If nothing else, you'll notice that there's a lot more text for Mr. G. Wait till you see the next slide. Mr. G had fooled around with a number of folks, 3 dating partners, 4 hookup partners, where there was some kind of fooling around that did not include sex. He's not a virgin. He's had sex with 1 woman that he was dating, 2 women in hookup scenarios. So on our scale, from what we've seen, he's fairly high on the list. Andrew's the only guy I've talked about who actually has more partners than Mr. G up here. But you'll notice that most of Mr. G's experience it doesn't get to the level of intercourse, doesn't get to coitus. He told a story about Megan, and this is a hookup story. Said, basically kind of been flirting with a girl from a sorority that my fraternity hangs out with a lot, flirting for a couple of months. I called her up. She'd be like, you need to come to this party with us. Just kind of escalated into making out for an extended period of time. I called her up a little later and asked if she wanted to go out to dinner, and she said it wouldn't be a good idea. Okay, this one is not like the other ones. Flirting for a couple of months, we haven't heard that before. That's new. Certainly doesn't fit our conception of a hookup as, kind of a one-night stand with a random partner. This is someone he knows well. She's the one that invites him to the party. They made out. I asked him if he thought he could have had sex with Megan that night, and he said, thinking back, I probably could have if I had said something like, hey, let's have sex, or do you want to go back to my place? But he didn't say that, and she didn't say that. If you think about our Casanova, Andrew, Hard to imagine him not saying that. But Mr. G doesn't quite get there. And then he does something kind of radically different. It's not a one-night thing. It's not a one and done. He tries to make this into a relationship. He calls her out. He calls her up and asks her out to dinner. This is wholly uncharted. I mean, it's not uncharted territory, but it certainly doesn't fit our expectations. Certainly doesn't fit our expectations of what guys are about. This is very non-stereotypical. Asked to describe a sexual experience within a relationship, he talked about Jen. And again, there's a lot of text here. He says, when I met her, I was really looking for a relationship, more for just to be with someone as opposed to, at the time I was feeling a bit depressed, so I felt like I needed to be with someone. If I saw her for 2 more weeks, basically just kind of stopped talking to her. It just didn't really evolve into anything. It was kind of like, we had a good time and as things got in the way, I didn't call her and she didn't call me. Interesting the way that worked out. Wow. We could talk about this for a long time, and we're not going to. Again, there's a certain level, much as with his hookup experience, there's a certain kind of passivity going on here. He's kind of waiting for her to take the lead, or he's not sure if he should ask. He was asked to describe a sexual experience. There's no sex in this story. There's a lot of relationships, starting with, I wanted to be in a relationship. But he was asked to tell a story about sex, and he told a story about relationship here. Those of you who are into kind of textual analyses notice that there's not a whole lot of I. There's a lot of it going on in this text, especially in the second half there. Very different pattern and very non-stereotypical. So we get these 4 different ways that guys are approaching dating and sex. Summary of the second half here. Actual data from real-life teenage boys and young men tells us that most guys have 2 partners or less per year, relatively low rates of sexual activity, that guys' motives for both dating and sex emphasize emotion and connection, that guys see first sex as relatively positive and loving and empowered, all of those things. It's not just, I got my rocks off. That was a little colorful for Wake Forest. That guys use different terms or ostensibly use different terms to distinguish connected and relational sex from unconnected and non-relational sex, but they're not always consistent with how they use those terms in everyday life. And we saw that there are at least 4, I just documented 4, there are at least 4 different approaches that guys take to dating and sex. And only one of those fits our stereotype. Grand conclusions, if you remember nothing else, remember this slide. Perception, this cultural notion we have that guys just want to screw around, is not the reality. It's only a very small percentage of guys who do that, but this stereotype gets reinforced from differences between men and women that we notice, even though a lot of those differences are coming from that minority. We see that men want emotional connection, that men's emotional experience is similar to women's emotional experience in a lot of ways, and that men adopt a variety of different approaches to dating and sex. There's not just a single style here. Thank you all for listening. I encourage you all to buy the book. The book will also tell you what to do about this, now that I've just given you the facts and figures. Thank you. And we have some time for questions, if anyone has questions.
You went through 4 of the types of the, sexual males that you categorize into. And I just was wondering, if you put Mr. G, into a different setting, my question would be if you didn't put him in a non-Greek setting, such as, an Andrew or a Derek, would he change? So my question would be, does a setting or a particular lifestyle, whether forced or not forced, create a different type of sexual man, or is it internal?
I think it's some of both. I think there's definitely a real piece for kind of who you are and your sense of who you are, but setting also plays a real part. If you have a group of guys that are like, go on, dude, do it, and we've certainly seen those movies enough, then that can change behavior. The other thing is that I mean, I like presenting Mr. G because he's fun to talk about, but there are times when I just think, like, Mr. G is kind of stuck because he feels like he wants to, like, he should be kind of, perhaps his true self is really to be a romantic, but he feels like he needs to live up to this image of a Casanova, and he's kind of caught in the middle there. And that maybe that's why he comes off as, I talk about him as passive, but you could talk about him as confused in that way, like he's not sure if it's really kind of okay to be this romantic guy.
I had a similar question. I was wondering why you decided to title Mr. G's classification emotional.
In part, I titled him emotional because of that, where that second quote starts with, I was just looking for a relationship. And again, the prompt for that is tell me about a sexual experience, and he starts telling me about I wanted to be in a relationship. So that's part of where that comes from. There's more text there that we haven't gotten here. But he talks, his feelings are very much front and center to a lot of his discussion in ways that we don't hear from any of the other guys, even when they're talking about their relationship experiences. Laura?
I was just wondering whether there's gender differences that affect the sort of social norms of social media on sexual behaviour. But when I say sexual behaviour, I don't necessarily mean engaging in sex or relationships. But the example that's coming to mind for me right now is when men or women have like bachelor parties or bachelorette parties. Like, it's quite typical. I'm just going to say, you hear about men all going to a strip club. And what I hear from a lot of them is like, well, I don't really want to do this, and it's just something you do, as it's just part of, the rite of passage before getting married. And I just wondered, do you think that there's a stronger effect in males due to this sort of more dominant social image and sort of sexual behaviours in that domain? Or do you think it's just equally as powerful with the rise of women like Beyonce and Sex and the City type characters?
I think kind of, well, I'll just state a kind of this dating and sexual realm. I think that the stereotype and how men get treated, at least in the media, narrows the range, keeps the range narrower for men than it does for women. Right? In the last decade now, we've had characters like Samantha from Sex and the City, very sex positive, very promiscuous, kind of a health educator's nightmare there. But, that's kind of so Samantha's groundbreaking in that way as a female character. For male characters, that kind of presentation is the only one that consistently gets lauded. When you talk about other male characters who are devoted to their wives, who say that they love their wives, especially guys on sitcoms, they also often get described as whipped. And, it's a lot of ball and chain stuff. And we don't really have kind of easily accessible popular press models for guys who love and care about their girlfriends or their wives. So in that way, I think it's narrower for guys.
Yeah, but do you think that would affect non-relationships or sexual behaviour? I know it's outside of the realm of your research.
Yeah, in general, I think the stereotypes for men tend to be narrower than for women. We've had 40 years of challenging stereotypes of women, and we've done very little to challenge stereotypes of men. In fact, men in some ways, so here the range has gotten narrower for men. When you look at males as father figures in mass media, they're pretty much all incompetent these days. They were not 30 years ago. 30 years ago, there were lots of competent fathers on TV. So I think I think it's just gotten narrower for men. And why is a whole different story. Maybe we'll get there.
Do you have any, is this all done in one geographic location? No.
My studies come from a couple different states, and then other stuff is worldwide.
Has there been, I guess, a multicultural replication of this study? And then you can relate it with meta-analysis? I was just curious.
Nice question. The 4 types that I presented, that's new stuff. Nobody else is really talking about guys in this way. And there's very little on women in this way either. There's a lot of literature just talks about it as though there's only one way. There's more coming out for women about this, very little for men. So I've seen one other study that talks about this kind of stuff for guys, but it's not really been replicate in any substantiated way.
And actually, I was thinking about the same thing, but also I didn't come here at the beginning. You might have said it. Is this? I mean, I'm assuming it's all heterosexual relationships. And what about race? All these groups of people, are they all together, or is there? Are they differentiated?
Most of the studies I've provided detail on are American samples, reasonably well mixed in terms of race. The interview guys, those are undergraduates at a reasonably selective public university. So there are probably some effects for at least socioeconomic status, which is confounded with race. But I've had guys from all different races, at least on numerical surveys, quantitative surveys, who fit each of these categories. The categories, at least, seem to transcend racial boundaries, at least and at least the Casanova approach and the romantic approach seem to transcend national boundaries as well. I have estimates of kind of how many guys would fit any of these categories, at least in the U.S., and probably are similar Western nation, are comparable Western nations. I suspect the percentages would shift quite a bit within particular subsamples of the U.S. and certainly across nations. But I still suspect that the romantic guys are the majority, kind of wherever we go. And that's certainly backed up by the international studies, like the International Sexuality Descriptive Project with its 62-nation sample. Anyone over here? I'm sorry, I've been favoring this side.
Yeah, I'm not a social scientist, but I have a methodological question. I noticed that in a lot of the data samples that you cite, you did more interviews with women, even though you're interested in men. And at least I thought so. And I was wondering why or how that happens. And then the other question I had is, in your narrative interviews, do you think the fact that the men are self-selecting, like they're volunteering and saying they're willing to do a survey, do you think that impacts which men are willing to speak to you? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the first question, so a lot of the survey data comes from males and females. I think those cross-sex comparisons are important. Some of the reason, and so that's part of the reason why to include women. The reason that we're running about twice as many women to men is that these are introductory psychology students, and it tends to run close to 2 to 1. But it's part of the reason to present the male numbers the way I do. As far as the guys who are willing to talk to me for the interview study at the end, we got these 4 different types, very different levels of experience. I don't think that, the guys who volunteered were necessarily are not representative in some way. I just think that they're kind of more comfortable talking about this stuff. Other questions? I'm going to come back to Rhonda, and then we'll go outside. Oh, sorry. One of you.
I was curious if you could talk just a little bit more about the qualifications you needed to find in your interview data to typecast somebody as the emotional type, and then if that was difficult to do. Like if you found kind of fuzzy boundaries in the lines between emotional and Casanova on one hand and one hand.
Yeah, the emo guys, those are not clear boundaries between the emo guys and the other categories. And again, part of that is that for the emo guys, kind of throughout their interviews, emotion comes up a lot and much more frequently than the other guys. And amount of emotion or emotional references was one of the things that we were coding for. We also coded for kind of level of independence versus interdependence. And they came up as much more interdependent. That said, there's that way, and as I mentioned before, they kind of feel like they want to be romantic guys, but they should feel like they should be Casanovas, and they're kind of caught in the middle there. That was the whole thing, right? Yeah. Okay.
In the homosexual reports,
Mm-hmm.
or from homosexual individuals, was there a noticeable, I guess, I guess, would you have to have created a scale to normalize everyone?
Okay, so it was an interview study, so we weren't so interested in the numbers, except as descriptive. The men who had sexual experience with men, they told we had very clear Casanova type behavior, very clear romantic behavior. One or two guys who were religious and really struggling with their religious Christian beliefs that homosexuality is a sin, with, this is who I am and how I was made, and, did God make a mistake, and really struggling with that, and so very low levels of experience. The men who had sex with men didn't really come off as the emo guys, but again, it's a pretty small study. We didn't try to scale their sexual experience in any way. We just reported the numbers straight up. Other questions? All the questions are over here.
The question about the song, the popular song study. So did you look at, you code by singer or by songwriter? Or do you look at both?
We coded by performer,
Okay.
whoever it was that got it into the top 50.
Okay, so you didn't code it by songwriter.
No, nor did we code for performer sexual orientation.
Right.
It's just by who the performer is.
As a health educator, I guess based on what you have learned, what kind of practical application would you suggest for the talk or for adolescents or young adults, moving into their sexual experiences based on what?
So there are a couple of things. One is that we need to start talking to our kids early on about dating and sexuality. I didn't mention this in the talk, but it's in the book. About 1/3 of 14-year-old boys report that they have voluntarily looked at porn. At age 8, it's 1%. So they're seeing this, in many cases, before we, as the adults, are ready to start talking to them. We need to start talking to them earlier. Folks from Future of Sexuality Education, FOSSE, have just come out with a new set of recommendations. They're non-binding, so they can't be guidelines, that say, kids need to, somewhere in first or second grade, kids should be getting very basic lessons that everything reproduces. And, we kind of scale it up as is age appropriate from there. So I think that's one of the big things. The other one, kind of on a more practical level, especially from a health education side and not just a parent side, is that we, in some ways, need to tweak our messages based on who the audience is. The guys who are Casanovas really need the message that you must use condoms every time, and their partners need to be getting that, whether their partners are male or female. But then we get, and it's kind of implied in the romantic description from Derek, like, the reason I waited and didn't just use a condom. So you're telling me that you're not going to use condoms after you've been tested. And we hear that a lot, especially in heterosexual couples, male-female couples, that they go 2 or 3 months where they're using condoms, often in conjunction with the pill, and then they stop using condoms. And if the only thing you're worried about is birth control, you're probably pretty safe. But that doesn't cover that doesn't address any disease status. And we really have done a bad job of getting that message through. We certainly say it often enough. That trust is not a good way to prevent a disease. And I think that's one of the big things that comes out here. Other questions? I could talk about this forever.
How did you account, or did you account for, I guess, music industry payoffs, payola?
We didn't. We're just looking at kind of, not Nielsen, Billboard rankings of top songs across 5 decades. And very straightforward. And very straightforward analysis of what's out there. Part of that is that the last 20 years we've seen a lot of analyses of rap lyrics. And rap comes across as very different in our full analysis. Rap lyrics, and especially the most popular rap songs, and the videos that go with them, very misogynistic, very objectifying of women, very degrading of women, And, you know, we got this kind of hyper-masculine image, especially in the videos, of the male performers. But there's kind of no standard to compare that to, except like, oh, we all know it wasn't like this before. Because nobody's really charted it before. So part of the project was to go back and see, is rap really doing something that different? And it is. Rap was the only genre with enough songs to do the analyses where they're actually talking about sex more often than they're talking about dating, even in the last 10 years. Everyone else, sex shows up 10 to 20% of the time, and for rap it's over half the time. So it's a very different lyrical content in addition to the musical content.
You read about like the ideas that women would reach sexual peaks at different ages in their life, and I have no idea whether that should be true or not. But men apparently have a younger sexual peak than women. And would the study be different if you would arrange the sexual peaks of both males and females than the same ages, or would the numbers stay the same, or of single females, of course, at that age?
Right. Wow. I didn't think about sexual peak at all. I have no idea. I'm just going to punt on that. And part of that is, part of the reason to do this presentation, write this book, is that there really aren't any books about male sexual development out there. There are a number of them about girl sexual development and female sexual development. And we, you know, again, I really want to challenge Casanova, challenge the stereotype that we have. I'm not really clear how sexual peaks might fit in there, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
Well, because we're so concerned with the whole stereotype of men just wanting to have sex.
Right.
But of course, between 20 and 30, I guess most adolescent males like definitely think about sex a lot of time. Not just thinking if different sexual peaks at some point could differentiate the numbers in females as well. You know.
It might. That's worth thinking about. Other questions? All right. Well, I will excuse you all. Thank you.